There's a special kind of pain that comes from being told you're not enough, especially when it happens in front of everyone you know. For Clara Whitmore, those words came from the man she thought would marry her, spoken loud enough for the whole town to hear. She believed her life was over, that no decent man would ever choose her now. Then a quiet mountain man named Joseph Hart rode into town and married her without hesitation. Everyone thought he was either desperate or foolish. What they didn't know was that Joseph carried a secret about Clara, one that would change everything. She was heir to a fortune hidden in the mountains, and he was the only one who knew. But how did he know when even Clara didn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory, sat in a valley where the wind carried the scent of pine and sage across weathered storefronts and dusty streets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business before you did, where reputations were built on Sunday mornings and destroyed by Tuesday afternoon. Clara Whitmore had lived there all her 24 years, and she'd always understood her place in the careful hierarchy of frontier life, respectable enough to be included, plain enough to be overlooked, poor enough to be pitied. She worked at Dixon's general store 6 days a week, measuring flour and cutting fabric, listening to the endless stream of gossip that flowed through the establishment like water through a creek bed. Mrs. Harriet Dixon, a widow of 15 years with steel-grey hair and a softer heart than she let on, had given Clara the position after her mother passed 2 years ago. It wasn't charity. Exactly. Clara had a good head for numbers and a patient way with difficult customers that made her invaluable, even if Mrs. Dixon would never say so out loud. The store smelled of coffee beans and leather, of pickles in their barrel, and the lavender soap Mrs. Dixon ordered special from St. Louis. Clara knew every item on every shelf, could find anything in the dim interior without a lamp. She knew which floorboards creaked, which customers would try to negotiate price, which children would pocket peppermint sticks when their mothers weren't watching. It was a small life, but it had been hers, and she'd found a certain peace in its predictability. Her days followed a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Wake before dawn in the small cabin at the edge of town, the same cabin where her mother had died, where Clara had nursed her through those final terrible months. Make coffee on the wood stove her father had built before he disappeared into the mountains when Clara was 8 years old. Walk the half-mile to the store, unlock the door, sweep the porch, arrange the display window, wait for Mrs. Dixon to arrive with fresh bread from the boarding-house kitchen. The morning customers were always the same. Reverend Samuel Cole, picking up his newspaper and discussing the state of the territory with whoever would listen. The railroad workers from the camp 2 miles east, buying tobacco and coffee before their shifts. The ranch wives, comparing prices and sharing news of births and deaths and everything in between. Clara listened more than she spoke, a habit formed over years of understanding that quiet girls were easier to have around than opinionated ones. Thomas Bennett had courted her for almost 2 years. He was the son of the town's banker, a position that carried weight in a place like Willow Creek. Thomas had brown hair that he kept carefully pomaded, a neat mustache, and the kind of confidence that came from never having wanted for anything. He wasn't handsome, exactly, but he was suitable, appropriate, expected. Clara had accepted his attentions because it seemed like the natural progression of things. He would call on Sunday afternoons, sitting in her small front room and talking about his work at the bank, about his father's plans to expand their lending operations, about the house he would inherit someday on the better side of town. She would serve tea and listen and nod at the right moments. He never asked much about her thoughts or her dreams, but she'd convinced herself that was normal. That marriage was about partnership and security, not passion or deep understanding. Her mother, in those final lucid days before the fever took her mind, had gripped Clara's hand with surprising strength. "You're worth more than this town knows," she'd whispered, her voice rough and urgent. "More than I could ever tell you. When the time comes, trust the mountain man. He'll know. He'll understand." Clara had dismissed it as fever dreams, the wandering thoughts of a dying woman. Her mother had always been a bit different, her manners too refined for a frontier widow, her speech too educated, her possessions too fine for someone supposedly born to hardship. The cameo brooch was one of those possessions. Clara wore it every day, pinned to whatever simple dress she'd chosen that morning. It was delicate work, ivory carved with the profile of a woman who might have been her grandmother, set in a thin gold frame. Her mother had treasured it, touched it often when she thought Clara wasn't watching. "This was my mother's," she'd said once, "and someday it will mean more to you than you can imagine." Clara hadn't understood then. She still didn't, not really. But she wore it faithfully. This small link to a past her mother had never fully explained. There were other things too, a few books with elaborate bookplates that read Whitmore Estate Library, a set of fine china wrapped carefully in cloth and stored in the cabin's only trunk, letters her mother had written but never sent, addressed to people Clara had never met. The town saw Clara as simple, the orphaned daughter of a disappeared father and a dead mother, working for wages, grateful for Thomas Bennet's attention, even if everyone agreed she was getting the better end of that bargain. They saw her plain brown hair that she wore in a simple bun, her grey or brown dresses made from discount fabric, her quiet demeanour. They saw someone unremarkable. What they didn't see was the way she read late into the night, burning through Mrs. Dixon's lending library and hungry for more. The way she could calculate complex figures in her head faster than men with university education. The way she noticed everything, the subtle shifts in people's expressions, the unspoken tensions in marriages, the debts mounting behind false smiles. She saw the whole town clearly, even as they looked right through her. She'd thought Thomas saw her differently. Thought that his consistent attention meant he understood there was more to her than met the eye. She'd built a future in her mind, modest but secure, a life of respectability, if not passion. She would be Mrs. Thomas Bennet. She would have a place that couldn't be questioned. She would finally, fully belong. The spring social had been scheduled for months. It was Willow Creek's biggest event, when the whole territory seemed to gather in the town hall for music and dancing and the kind of socializing that frontier isolation made precious. Everyone knew Thomas would announce their engagement that night. It was understood, expected, practically guaranteed. Clara had saved for months to have a new dress, made of soft blue cotton with lace at the collar, nothing extravagant, but pretty enough to mark the occasion. She'd walked into that town hall with hope fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. She'd thought she knew how the evening would end. She'd been so certain of her place, her future, her worth in Thomas Bennet's eyes. She'd been wrong about everything. But that was before Joseph Hart, before the mountains revealed their secrets, before Clara learned that sometimes the worst moments of your life are really the doorway to becoming who you were always meant to be. Before she understood that her mother's dying words weren't fever dreams at all, but the most important truth anyone had ever told her. The story of how she learned all this begins with the worst night of her life, standing in that town hall with the whole territory watching, hearing words that would change everything. The town hall had been transformed for the occasion. Paper lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light across the wooden floors that had been swept and polished until they gleamed. Tables lined the walls, covered with dishes brought by every family, roasted chicken and potatoes, fresh bread, pies made from preserved fruit, cakes that represented hours of careful work. The territorial band had come all the way from Cheyenne, their fiddles and guitars filling the space with music that made even the oldest ranchers tap their feet. Clara had arrived with Mrs. Dixon, who'd insisted on escorting her like a nervous mother preparing her daughter for presentation. Her new blue dress rustled as she walked, the lace collar scratching slightly against her neck. She'd pinned her mother's cameo at her throat, the ivory profile catching the lamplight. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than usual, pulled back with combs she'd borrowed from Mrs. Dixon. She felt almost pretty, or at least as close to pretty as she'd ever managed. Thomas was already there, standing near the punch bowl with his father and several other prominent men. He wore a new suit, black wool that must have cost a month's wages, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points. When he saw Clara enter, he smiled the public smile he wore when conducting bank business and raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. But he didn't come to her, didn't cross the room to greet her or take her arm. Just that smile and that small gesture, and then his attention returned to the men around him. Clara told herself it was fine. He was conducting business. She accepted a cup of punch from Reverend Cole, who winked at her kindly and said something about exciting announcements. She stood with Mrs. Dixon and the other unmarried women, listening to their chatter about dresses and music and which cowboys were handsome enough to dance with. An hour passed, then another. Thomas moved through the room, shaking hands and laughing at jokes, but he never approached her, never asked her to dance, never acknowledged her presence beyond that initial smile. Clara felt something cold beginning to form in her stomach, a weight that grew heavier with each passing minute. Then Sarah Pemberton arrived. Sarah was everything. Clara wasn't blonde curls piled artfully on her head, a dress of emerald silk that must have been ordered from San Francisco, curves that drew every male eye in the room. She was the mayor's daughter, educated back east at a finishing school, full of sophisticated airs and the kind of beauty that made other women feel inadequate just by standing near her. She'd been visiting her aunt in Denver for the past 3 months, and her return had been the subject of considerable speculation. She swept into the hall on her father's arm, and the room seemed to reorganize itself around her presence. Thomas looked up from his conversation, and Clara saw something cross his face, an expression she'd never seen him direct at her. Want, unmistakable and immediate. Sarah smiled at the room, at the attention, and her eyes found Thomas with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. She said something to her father, who nodded indulgently, and then she was moving toward the punch bowl, toward Thomas, her silk dress shimmering in the lamplight like water. Clara watched Thomas straighten his jacket, watched him abandon the conversation he'd been having, watched him meet Sarah halfway across the floor. They spoke. Sarah laughed, touching his arm with practiced ease. Thomas leaned in, saying something that made her laugh again. And then, with the entire town watching, with Clara standing not 20 feet away, Thomas offered Sarah his arm and led her to the dance floor. The fiddles started a waltz. Thomas and Sarah moved together with the easy grace of people who belonged in each other's arms. They looked right together, both beautiful, both wealthy, both part of that elevated class that frontier towns created to remind themselves they were civilized. Clara stood frozen, the punch cup trembling in her hand. Understanding, slowly dawning like a sunrise, she didn't want to see. Mrs. Dixon touched her elbow. "Clara, dear, perhaps we should—" But before they could move, before Clara could escape to some dark corner to process what was happening, Thomas and Sarah finished their dance. The music ended. Thomas led Sarah back toward the punch bowl, back toward the gathered crowd, back toward where Clara stood, rooted to the floor like a tree that had forgotten how to bend in the wind. Thomas looked at Clara directly for the first time that evening. His expression held no apology, no regret, no acknowledgement of the future they'd planned together. Just a cool assessment, like a banker reviewing a loan application from someone with insufficient collateral. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the nearby crowd. "I'm glad you're here. Saves me the trouble of calling on you tomorrow. I wanted you to hear this in person, with witnesses." He paused, and Clara saw satisfaction in his eyes, the pleasure of a man about to prove his own importance. "Sarah has accepted my proposal of marriage. We'll be wed in August." The room blurred. Clara heard gasps, whispers, felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward her. Someone said her name. Mrs. Dixon's hand tightened on her elbow, But all Clara could focus on was Thomas's face, and the words that came next, delivered with casual cruelty. "I'm sure you understand, Clara. A man in my position needs a wife who brings something to the partnership. Breeding, connections, beauty. You're a good woman, I'm sure, reliable. But let's be honest, you're plain, you're poor, and you have no prospects. Nobody will have you now, not after this. You should be grateful I paid you any attention at all." Sarah laughed, a light, tinkling sound that cut like broken glass. "Oh, Thomas, don't be cruel. I'm sure Clara will find someone. Perhaps one of the ranch hands needs a cook." The humiliation crashed over Clara in waves. She saw pity on some faces, amusement on others, satisfaction on a few who'd always resented her quiet competence. She saw Reverend Cole looking stricken, saw Mrs. Dixon's fury building, saw Thomas's father turned away in what might have been shame or simple disinterest. She wanted to say something devastating, something that would cut him the way he'd cut her. She wanted to cry or scream or disappear into the earth. Instead, she did the only thing that seemed possible. She set down her punch cup with careful precision, turned and walked out of that town hall with her spine straight and her head high, even as tears began streaming down her face. Mrs. Dixon followed her into the night, calling her name, but Clara kept walking. Through the dark streets of Willow Creek, past the closed shops and quiet houses, past the church and the bank that bore Thomas's family name, all the way to her small cabin at the edge of town. She let herself in, closed the door, and finally let herself collapse against it, sliding to the floor as sobs tore through her chest. She'd believed she had value. She'd believed someone saw her worth. She'd been wrong about everything that mattered. The next 3 days were a blur of shame and isolation. Clara refused to leave her cabin, ignored Mrs. Dixon's knocking, lived on stale bread and well water. She couldn't face the town, couldn't bear the whispers and pitying looks, and the confirmation of what Thomas had declared, that nobody would have her now. That she was too plain, too poor, too ordinary to deserve love or respect, or a future worth living. On the 4th morning she woke to find someone standing at the edge of her property, barely visible in the pre-dawn light. A man, tall and rough-dressed, watching her cabin with patient intensity. She'd never seen him before. His weathered face, his long dark hair touched with grey, his stillness that spoke of mountains and solitude and secrets kept close. His name was Joseph Hart, and he was about to change everything. They broke camp at dawn, the mountain air sharp and clean in Clara's lungs. Joseph moved through the morning routine with quiet efficiency, rekindling the fire, making coffee strong enough to wake the dead, frying salt pork in a cast-iron pan that had clearly seen years of use. Clara watched and learned, understanding that survival in this country required skills she'd never needed in town. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, Joseph began teaching her things: how to read the weather in the shape of clouds, which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you, how to find north by the moss on trees and the position of the sun. He spoke like a patient teacher, never condescending, always assuming she was capable of learning. And Clara discovered she was hungry for this knowledge, eager to understand this wild country that would be her home. "Your father knew these mountains," Joseph said, as they followed a narrow trail along a steep ridge. "He had a gift for reading the land. Told me once he felt more at peace in the high country than he ever did among people." Clara's hands tightened on the wagon seat. "What else did he tell you? About himself? About why he came here?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. He said he was running from expectations, from a life that didn't fit. He said some men are born to wear suits and sit in offices, and some men need space to breathe. He glanced at her. "He asked about you. Wanted to know if you were safe, if your mother was managing. I told him what I knew, that you were in Willow Creek, that your mother worked as a seamstress, that you seemed like a bright girl. He smiled when I said that. Said you got your brains from your mother's side. When was this? 8 years ago, maybe 9. Up near the northern ridge, where the big timber grows. We spent 3 days at the same camp, waiting out a storm. He was tracking something, though he wouldn't say what. Just kept studying maps and muttering about property lines and legal claims. Joseph's expression grew thoughtful. I got the sense he was looking for something specific, something important. Clara absorbed this. Trying to reconcile the father, she remembered the quiet man who'd taught her to read, who'd sung her songs in a language she didn't understand, who'd disappeared without explanation, with this description of a man searching the mountains for something he wouldn't name. By mid-afternoon, they'd climbed high enough that the trees changed from pine to aspen, their white bark glowing in the mountain light. The trail widened into a valley that took Clara's breath away. Meadows stretched between stands of timber, a creek running silver through the center, mountains rising on all sides like cathedral walls. It was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. "Almost there," Joseph said, and Clara heard something in his voice that might have been pride or anticipation. They followed the creek upstream for another mile, then rounded a bend, and Clara saw Joseph's home for the first time. She'd expected a cabin, rough logs, a single room, the bare minimum required for shelter. What she found instead made her question everything she thought she knew about mountain trappers. The house was built of squared logs, fitted together with master craftsmanship. It wasn't large, perhaps 4 rooms, but it was solid and well-proportioned, with real glass windows and a stone chimney rising from a cedar-shake roof. A wide porch wrapped around the front, with carved posts that spoke of someone who valued beauty as well as function. Outbuildings stood nearby a barn, a smokehouse, a root cellar built into the hillside. Everything was well maintained, carefully arranged, the work of someone who planned to stay. Joseph helped Clara down from the wagon, watching her face as she took it all in. "It's more than you expected," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Much more," Clara admitted. "Joseph, this is a real homestead. This is—" She stopped, not wanting to offend him by sounding too surprised. "Come inside," he said simply. The interior took her breath away for a second time. The main room was spacious, with a large stone fireplace and furniture that, while simple, was beautifully made. But what stopped Clara in her tracks was what she saw covered in dust sheets, a dining table of polished oak, chairs with carved backs, a sideboard that would have looked at home in any fine house back east. Through a doorway, she glimpsed a real bed with a carved headboard, covered in cloth, but unmistakably quality furniture. "I don't understand," Clara said slowly, turning to look at Joseph. "You're a trapper. How do you have—" She gestured at the house, the furniture, the evidence of wealth that contradicted everything he'd told her about himself. Joseph removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in what seemed like nervousness. Around his neck, Clara noticed for the first time, he wore something on a leather cord, an old iron key, dark with age. "I told you I wasn't poor," he said carefully. "And I told you the truth. I am a trapper, and I do live simply. But I didn't tell you everything. Couldn't, not until I was sure." He met her eyes directly. "I value good craftsmanship, and I value being prepared for possibilities I didn't think would happen." Clara walked slowly around the room, lifting dust sheets to reveal more evidence of quality and care. A bookshelf filled with leather-bound volumes, a writing desk with brass fittings, dishes of fine china wrapped carefully in cloth. None of it matched the rough mountain man who'd proposed marriage on her porch. "Who are you, really?" she asked, turning to face him. "Not the story you told me. The truth." Joseph set his hat down on a bench near the door. "I'm exactly who I said I was, a man who lives in these mountains, a man who values honest work and his own company. But I'm also—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I'm also a man who was hired to watch over something, to keep it safe until the rightful owner could be found." "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering directly, Joseph walked to the fireplace and removed a loose stone from the mantel. From the cavity behind it, he pulled out a leather document folder, the kind lawyers used for important papers. He held it for a moment, his expression conflicted, then handed it to Clara. "Your mother knew," he said quietly. "In her last days she knew. That's why she told you to trust the mountain man, because she knew I'd been looking for you, that I'd find you eventually. That when the time was right, I'd tell you the truth." Clara's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were documents, deeds, surveys, legal papers, covered in dense text and official seals. And at the top of the first document, in formal script, she read, "Property of the Whitmore estate. To be held in trust for Clara Whitmore, sole surviving heir, upon proof of identity and majority." The papers slipped from her fingers, scattering across the floor. Clara looked at Joseph, at this stranger she'd married, at the house that suddenly made terrible sense, at the life that had just turned itself inside out for the second time in a week. "What is this?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. Already understood why her mother had died with secrets on her lips, why her father had disappeared into these mountains, why Joseph had appeared in Willow Creek at exactly the right moment. "It's your inheritance," Joseph said simply, "and I've been waiting 8 years to give it to you." Clara sat at the oak table, her table, apparently while Joseph made tea with the careful movements of a man trying not to spook a wounded animal. The scattered documents lay between them like accusation or explanation. She wasn't sure which. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd just learned, trying to reconcile the life she'd known with this impossible truth. "Start at the beginning," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "No more partial truths, no more careful omissions. Everything." Joseph set a cup of tea in front of her and sat down across the table. He looked older suddenly, worn down by the weight of secrets kept too long. "Your grandfather was Charles Whitmore," he began. "He came to the territory 40 years ago and built an empire, timber, mining, land holdings, made himself rich 3 times over. He had 2 sons. Your uncle, also named Charles, was the eldest. Your father, Nathaniel, was younger by 10 years. My father never mentioned any of this, because he hated it, the business, the money, the way his father operated. Charles Whitmore the elder was a hard man, ruthless in his dealings, cruel to his workers, obsessed with profit above all else. Nathaniel couldn't stomach it. When he was 25, he walked away, changed his name, slightly started calling himself Nathan White instead of Nathaniel Whitmore, and disappeared. Clara felt tears threatening but held them back. "And my mother, your mother, was Elizabeth Thornton, daughter of a Boston lawyer. She met your father when he was still part of the business, fell in love with him despite his family's reputation. When he left, she left with him. They lived quietly, moving from town to town, trying to stay off the old man's radar. Your grandfather spent years searching for them, wanting to drag Nathaniel back, but your father was clever, kept moving, kept his head down. Why didn't they just stay gone? Why come back here?" Joseph's expression darkened. "Because Charles the elder died 12 years ago, and your uncle inherited everything. Your uncle tried to find your father, to reconcile, but by then your parents were settled in Willow Creek, and your father didn't want to be found. 3 years later, your uncle died suddenly, thrown from a horse, and left no children, no wife, no direct heirs." He leaned forward. "The estate lawyers started searching for surviving family. They found records of Nathaniel's marriage, found your mother's family in Boston, followed the trail west. By the time they tracked your parents down, your father was already gone, disappeared into these mountains 8 years ago, looking for something. For what? For this," Joseph gestured around them. "Your grandfather had a secondary property, a mountain retreat he kept separate from the main estate. Your father knew about it, thought if he could find it and prove the ownership, he could claim it for you, give you something that wasn't tainted by his father's cruelty. He spent years searching these mountains. Did he find it? He did. Found this house, found the original deed, found proof of ownership, but he never made it back to Willow Creek. I don't know what happened to him, whether he got lost, fell, decided to keep running. I helped him search the last few weeks, and then one morning he was just gone. Left me a letter asking me to watch over the property, to find his daughter if anything happened to him, to make sure you got what was rightfully yours. Clara stood abruptly, needing to move, to process. She walked to the window and looked out at the valley, at the mountains beyond. And the main estate, the timber mills and mines and all of it, that's still in legal trust, being managed by lawyers. But Clara, Joseph's voice made her turn back, it's worth more than this town has seen in its entire existence. The lawyers estimate over $100,000 in land and holdings, and it's all yours. You're the sole surviving heir of the Whitmore fortune. The number was so large it became meaningless. Clara couldn't imagine that much money, couldn't reconcile it with the woman who'd measured out flour and cut fabric for wages. Why didn't they find me? The lawyers? They did. 8 months ago, sent letters to your mother, who was dying by then. She wrote back, confirmed your identity, but asked them to wait. She wanted you settled, wanted you safe, before they revealed everything. She named me as the trustee, who could verify your identity and prepare you for the inheritance. Joseph pulled a folded letter from his pocket, worn thin from handling. This is what she wrote. Read it. Clara took the letter with shaking hands. Her mother's handwriting, those familiar loops and flourishes, covered both sides of the paper. As she read, tears finally spilled over. The letter explained everything: the family history, the reasons for hiding, the fear that the Whitmore name would bring more harm than good. Her mother's final wish was for Clara to find someone trustworthy before learning about the money, someone who would value her for herself rather than her inheritance. If Joseph Hart finds you, her mother had written, trust him. He was your father's only friend in those final days. He is honorable beyond measure. And if he offers to help you, accept it. Clara set the letter down carefully, her mind reeling. You knew all this when you proposed to me. You knew I was rich, that I'd inherit. I knew, and you married me anyway. Why? The lawyers could have told me. I could have managed the estate myself, hired help, found my own way. Joseph met her eyes steadily. Because your mother asked me to protect you. Because I promised your father I'd watch over his daughter. Because... He stopped, choosing his words carefully. Because in 6 months of watching you in that town, I saw a woman of strength and grace who deserved better than how she was treated. The inheritance was secondary. You were the point. Clara didn't know whether to laugh or cry or rage at the complicated web of secrets and good intentions that had brought her here. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. Is any of this real, Joseph, or am I just an obligation you've fulfilled? He stood slowly, crossing the room until he stood before her. Every word I spoke to you was true. I do need a partner. I do value honesty. I did want a wife I could respect. He reached out carefully, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand gently. The inheritance complicates things, I know. But it doesn't change the fact that I chose you, Clara. Money or no money, estate or no estate, I chose you. 2 days later, after hours of conversation and careful document reading, Joseph hitched up the wagon for another journey. This time they headed north and east toward a mining settlement called Silver Creek, where Martin Sawyer, the estate's attorney, maintained an office. Clara wore one of the dresses they'd found in the house, fine wool in deep blue, tailored to fit a woman of her size with eerie precision. Her mother had planned ahead, it seemed, right down to the clothing. The journey took them through increasingly remote country. Joseph pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear, a meadow where wildflowers would bloom come summer, a creek where gold had been found, but never in quantities worth mining. He spoke easily, sharing his knowledge of this land, but Clara noticed he watched her carefully, gauging her reactions, perhaps worried she'd bolt now that she knew the truth. She wouldn't bolt. She'd spent the past 2 days absorbing the impossible truth of her situation, reading through documents until her eyes ached, trying to understand the magnitude of what she'd inherited. And through it all, Joseph had been patient, answering questions, explaining legal terminology, never pushing, never presuming. If anything, he'd become more formal, more careful, as if the revelation of her wealth had created a distance between them that hadn't existed before. Silver Creek was larger than Willow Creek, rougher around the edges, a place where miners and loggers came to spend their wages on whiskey and entertainment. The attorney's office sat on the respectable end of the main street, a wooden building with a painted sign reading, "Sawyer and Associates, Legal Services." Martin Sawyer himself was a surprise. Clara had expected someone old, severe, dressed in black like an undertaker. Instead, the man who greeted them was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He shook Joseph's hand warmly, then turned to Clara with an expression of such relief that she almost smiled despite her nervousness. "Miss Whitmore, or should I say Mrs. Hart now, your mother spoke of you with such love." He gestured them into his office, a cramped space lined with books and filing cabinets. "Please sit. I've been waiting 3 years to have this conversation." Over the next 2 hours, Martin Sawyer explained the full scope of her inheritance with a clarity that made Clara's head spin. The Whitmore estate consisted of 5,000 acres of prime mountain land, 3 working sawmills, mineral rights to several promising claims, standing timber worth tens of thousands, and a cash reserve of over $30,000 held in banks in Denver and San Francisco. The estate had been generating income throughout the years it sat in trust, managed by Sawyer's firm, the profits accumulating steadily. "Your grandfather built all this," Sawyer explained, spreading maps across his desk. "Your uncle maintained it until his death 5 years ago. Since then, we've managed it conservatively, waiting for you. The total value—" He paused, looking at Clara over his spectacles. "We estimate the estate is worth approximately $140,000, perhaps more, depending on mineral surveys that are still being conducted." Clara felt the room tilt. That amount of money was inconceivable, more than she could spend in several lifetimes, more than entire towns were worth. "There's something you need to understand," Sawyer continued, his expression growing serious. "Your grandfather acquired much of this land and these holdings through, let's say, aggressive business practices. Some would call it worse. He crushed competitors, exploited workers, used legal technicalities to seize property from people who couldn't fight back. Your father left because he couldn't stomach it. Your uncle tried to reform the business practices, which is why many of the workers and managers you'll inherit are loyal and well-treated. But the original foundation, he spread his hands. It was built on ruthless ambition." "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked quietly. "Because you have a choice. You can sell everything, walk away with the cash, and never think about the Whitmore name again. Or you can claim it, manage it, try to build something better from what your grandfather created. But you should know what you're taking on." Clara looked at Joseph, who'd been silent throughout the meeting. "What do you think?" "I think it's your decision," he said carefully. "I was hired to help you claim what's yours, not to tell you what to do with it. But you have an opinion." Joseph met her eyes directly. "I think your father wanted you to have choices. Freedom to live how you wanted, free from worry about money or security. If taking the estate would trap you in something you hate, walk away. If you see possibility in it, good you could do, wrong you could right, then consider staying." He smiled slightly. "Either way, you're not making this decision alone. For whatever it's worth, I'm here. Sawyer cleared his throat gently. There's one more thing you should know. Once word gets out about this, and it will get out, these things always do, your life will change. People will come out of the woodwork claiming connection to you, asking for money, proposing business deals. Some will be legitimate, many won't be. You'll need to be careful about who you trust. Including you? Clara asked bluntly. Sawyer smiled with what seemed like genuine amusement. Fair question. I've been paid well for my 3 years of work managing this estate. My fee is clearly documented in these contracts. I have no interest in anything beyond professional compensation. But yes, you should absolutely verify everything I've told you with independent sources. Never take anyone's word, including mine, when this much money is involved. Over the next hour, they worked through the necessary documents. Clara signed papers verifying her identity, accepting the inheritance, authorizing Sawyer to continue managing the operational aspects until she was ready to take over directly. Her hand cramped from writing her name, Clara Whitmore Hart, over and over on legal forms. Finally, Sawyer pulled out one more document, this one older and more worn than the others. This is what your father found. The deed to this mountain property, the retreat your grandfather built. It's separate from the main estate, deeded specifically to my son Nathaniel and his heirs. Your father's name is right here. He pointed to the faded ink. This property was always meant for him, and now it's yours. Clara took the deed carefully, studying her grandfather's signature, her father's name written in formal script. This piece of paper represented her father's years of searching, his desperate desire to give her something good and clean, untainted by his father's methods. Tears blurred her vision. There's just one thing I don't understand, she said, looking up at Sawyer. How did you find Joseph? How did you know to hire him to watch over me? Sawyer glanced at Joseph, who gave a small nod. That's where the story gets interesting, the attorney said. I didn't hire Joseph. Your mother did. Clara's head snapped toward Joseph. Joseph shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. When your mother got sick, she wrote to the lawyers, told them she was dying, that she needed someone to watch over you after she was gone. She asked specifically for me, said your father had mentioned me in one of his last letters home, said I was trustworthy. The lawyers tracked me down 8 months ago and offered me a position as estate guardian and trustee. My job was to verify your identity, protect you from fortune hunters, and... He paused. And if necessary, marry you to ensure no one could question your claim to the inheritance or try to control you through marriage. Clara felt her breath catch. You were hired to marry me. I was authorized to propose marriage if I believed it was necessary to protect you and the inheritance, Joseph corrected carefully. The decision to actually do it, and when, was left to my discretion. And you just happened to propose right after Thomas rejected me, right when I was most vulnerable and desperate? Joseph's jaw tightened. I'd been in Willow Creek for 6 months, watching you, making sure you were who the lawyers thought you were, waiting for the right time to approach you. When Thomas humiliated you at that dance, when I saw how the town turned on you, he stopped, his hands clenched on his knees. I saw an opportunity, yes, a moment when you'd be open to leaving. But Clara, I could have approached you a dozen different ways, could have told you about the inheritance first, let you make decisions from a position of power. I chose to propose as myself, as Joseph Hart the trapper, because I wanted... He stopped again, struggling with words. I wanted you to choose me without knowing about the money. Wanted to know if we could build something real before all this complicated it. But it's all built on lies, Clara said, her voice breaking. Everything. The marriage, the proposal. Coming here, it's all because you were paid to protect me. The lawyers paid me to find you, verify your identity, and protect the inheritance, Joseph said quietly. Everything else proposing to you, hoping you'd say yes, wanting to build a life together that was just me. Being selfish, wanting something I had no right to want. Sawyer stood, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature the conversation had taken. "I'll give you some privacy. Clara, you have my authorization to access estate funds immediately. I'll have documents drawn up for whatever you need: investment in property, business ventures, charitable donations, whatever you decide. Take your time. There's no rush." After he left, Clara and Joseph sat in silence. The office suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Clara looked at this man she'd married, this stranger who knew everything about her while she'd known nothing about him, and felt something crack open inside her chest, anger and hurt, and underneath it all, a terrible understanding that nothing in life was ever simple or clean. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what any of this means." Joseph nodded slowly, his face carefully neutral. "Whatever you need. I meant what I said, Clara. You're not alone in this, but I understand if you can't trust that right now." They left the attorney's office and climbed back into the wagon without speaking. The journey home to the house that was hers, but felt like a stranger's, stretched before them like a road with no clear destination. The days that followed were strange and careful, full of conversations that circled around what needed to be said, but never quite landed. Joseph gave Clara space, sleeping in the barn, despite her protests that it was his house and she was the interloper. She spent her time reading through documents, learning the scope of what she now owned, trying to understand how a girl who'd measured flour for wages had become one of the wealthiest women in the territory. She found her father's journal in the desk drawer, 3 years of entries documenting his search for the mountain property. His handwriting was achingly familiar, the same careful script he'd used to teach her letters when she was small. Reading his words, understanding his desperation to give her something good and clean, something not tainted by his father's cruelty, it broke something open in her that she'd kept locked tight since the day he disappeared. "I failed her in so many ways," he'd written in one of the final entries. "Left her without a father, left Elizabeth to struggle alone, ran like a coward from responsibility. But if I can do this one thing, find this property, secure her future, give her freedom to choose her own life, maybe it will count for something. Maybe she'll forgive me." Clara cried over those pages, grieving the father she'd lost and the man she'd never fully known. Joseph found her that way, tears streaming down her face, her father's journal clutched to her chest. He didn't say anything, just sat down on the floor beside her chair and waited while she wept. When she finally spoke, telling him what her father had written, Joseph's hand found hers and held it gently. "He loved you," Joseph said quietly. "That much was always clear. He just didn't know how to be what you needed and stay true to himself at the same time. Some men break under that kind of conflict." "Did you love him?" Clara asked. "In the time you knew him?" Joseph considered the question carefully. "I respected him, admired his principles, his determination to do right even when it cost him everything. Love that takes longer to build. But I think we were heading that direction. He was the kind of man who'd have made a good friend, given time." Over the next week, they found a tentative rhythm. Joseph taught Clara to ride properly, not the side-saddle nonsense she'd learned in town, but real riding, astride and confident. They explored the valley together, and he showed her the extent of the property, the boundaries, the resources, the places her grandfather had claimed and her father had reclaimed. He taught her to shoot, patient through her first dozen failures, until she finally hit the target with enough accuracy to protect herself. At night, they sat on the porch and talked about everything except the question hanging between them: what happened now? Joseph told her stories about his years in the mountains, about trappers he'd known and winters he'd survived, about the silence that could be either peaceful or maddening depending on your state of mind. Clara shared memories of her mother, stories she'd never told anyone, fears she'd carried since childhood. "I'm afraid I'll become like him," she admitted one evening as the stars emerged overhead. "That having this much power, this much money, will turn me into someone ruthless, someone who values profit over people." Then don't, Joseph said simply. You know what kind of person you don't want to be. That's half the battle. The other half is choosing different every single day. Is it that simple? No, but it's that clear. He looked at her directly. Your mother ran from wealth and chose love. Your father ran from cruelty and chose principles. You get to choose something different than both of them. You get to claim your inheritance and decide what kind of legacy you'll build with it. Clara mulled that over, letting the truth of it settle into her bones. She'd been thinking of the inheritance as a burden or a trap, something that would define her whether she wanted it to or not. But Joseph was right. It was also a choice. A chance to do something meaningful with resources most people never imagined having. 3 weeks after the meeting with Martin Sawyer, Clara made her decision. She would claim the inheritance fully, but she wouldn't hide in the mountains with it. She would return to Willow Creek, not to prove anything to Thomas Bennet or the people who'd pitied her, but to begin her work properly. To set up charitable trusts, invest in infrastructure, create opportunities for people who'd never had them. To use her grandfather's ruthlessly acquired fortune for something better than he'd ever imagined. I want to go back, she told Joseph over breakfast, to Willow Creek, not to live this is home now, but to face them, to let them see what became of the woman nobody would have. Joseph's expression was carefully neutral. That's your choice. But Clara, you don't owe them anything. Not explanations, not displays of your success. Nothing. I know. This isn't about them, not really. It's about me, putting that chapter to rest properly, showing myself that I'm not ashamed anymore. She met his eyes. Will you come with me? As what? Your husband? Your employee? Your guardian? There was no bitterness in the question, just honest uncertainty about where they stood. Clara had been thinking about that question for days, turning it over in quiet moments, examining her feelings with the same careful attention she'd applied to legal documents. What she'd found surprised her. As my husband, she said firmly, because that's what you are. And because, she took a breath, gathering courage, because in these weeks of watching you give me space, watching you be patient and honest, and everything Thomas never was, I've realized something. You were right. The proposal might have been calculated, but what came after wasn't. You chose me, Joseph, and I'm choosing you back. Joseph's expression transformed hope and relief, and something deeper that made Clara's heart race. You're sure? Because, Clara, I need you to be absolutely certain. I won't have you wondering in 5 years if you settled for me because I was convenient or because the lawyers paid me. I need you to choose this, choose us, with your eyes wide open. My eyes are open, Clara said, standing and crossing to where he sat. She took his weathered hands in hers, these hands that had built houses and caught animals, and held her gently when she cried, I'm not settling. I'm claiming the inheritance, yes, but also this, us, the life we could build together. Joseph pulled her down onto his lap, his arms wrapping around her waist, his forehead resting against hers. Then yes, I'll go with you to Willow Creek. I'll stand beside you while you claim your identity and your fortune. I'll be whatever you need me to be. Just be yourself, Clara whispered. That's all I've ever wanted. They spent the next few days preparing for the journey. Clara wrote letters to Martin Sawyer, requesting that he meet them in Willow Creek with all necessary documentation. She selected clothing, not the plain dresses of her old life, but the fine garments found in the house, tailored for her by a mother who'd planned for this moment. She practiced the words she'd say, the way she'd carry herself, the woman she'd become in the space between rejection and revelation. Joseph cleaned weapons and prepared the wagon, but he also did something else. He rode into Silver Creek and returned with a small velvet box that he presented to Clara at dinner. Inside was a ring not plain gold like the simple band they'd exchanged at their hasty wedding, but a delicate piece with intertwined bands representing 2 lives joining as one. It was beautiful and meaningful and exactly right. "Marry me again," Joseph said, going down on one knee in their kitchen like a man courting properly. "Not because lawyers hired me, not because you need protection, not because it's convenient or strategic. Marry me because I love you, because you're the bravest, smartest, strongest woman I've ever known, because I want to spend every day of my life proving that you made the right choice." Clara's tears came fast and fierce. "Yes, yes, Joseph Hart, I'll marry you, again and always, and as many times as you want." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, another thing he'd planned carefully, getting her size right without her knowing. Then he stood and kissed her, really kissed her, for the first time since their wedding day. And Clara understood that this was the real beginning, the moment when calculation gave way to choice, when duty transformed into desire. That night, she didn't sleep in the guest room. She moved into the master bedroom, into the carved bed her mother had ensured was waiting, and Joseph held her through the darkness like a promise made solid. They didn't rush, there was time now, all the time in the world, but they lay tangled together, learning each other's breath and heartbeat, speaking in whispers about the future they'd build. "What will you do first?" Joseph asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "With the estate, the money, all of it." Clara had thought about this, made lists in her mind during long days of planning. Fund a school in Willow Creek, a real school with trained teachers and books, and opportunity for every child, regardless of whether their parents can pay. Then medical services, bring a doctor to the territory, make sure people don't die from treatable illnesses because they can't afford care. She paused, thinking. And workers' rights. Fair wages at the sawmills, safe conditions, no more of what my grandfather did. That'll make you some enemies. The other business owners won't appreciate you setting new standards. Let them be enemies. I have enough money to weather their disapproval. And Joseph, she turned to look at him in the moonlight streaming through the window. I want to search for my father, hire trackers, offer rewards, whatever it takes. I need to know what happened to him. Joseph was quiet for a long moment. I know, but not knowing is worse. He died or disappeared trying to give me something. I owe it to him to find out the truth. Then we'll search, together. Joseph kissed her forehead gently. Whatever you need, Clara, I'm with you. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other and in plans for a future neither had expected, but both had chosen. And when morning came, they packed the wagon with fine clothes and legal documents, and the quiet confidence of two people who knew exactly who they were and what they were worth, both separately and together. Willow Creek was waiting. Thomas Bennett was waiting. The whole territory would soon know the truth about Clara Whitmore Hart and the fortune she commanded. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that she was heading back not as a victim seeking vindication, but as a woman who'd found her strength in the space between loss and love. Thomas's face flushed red with humiliation and anger. You can't just, Clara, be reasonable. We had an understanding. I made a mistake, I'll admit that. But surely you can see that you and we make sense. Your fortune, my family's position, we could what? Clara interrupted, her voice still calm but edged with steel. Build a marriage on your regret and my money? Thomas, you didn't want me when you thought I was poor. You certainly don't get me now that I'm not. Sarah Pemberton spoke up, her voice shrill with barely contained fury. Thomas, what is she talking about? What understanding? Thomas ignored his fiancée, his attention fixed entirely on Clara, with the single-minded focus of a man watching his future crumble. I was young, stupid. I let my father pressure me into making choices I didn't really want. But Clara, we courted for 2 years. That has to count for something. It does count, Clara agreed. It taught me exactly what kind of man you are, someone who measures people by what they can offer him. someone who discards them publicly when they no longer serve his purposes. She stepped closer, and Joseph moved with her, a silent presence at her shoulder. You told me I was too plain, too poor, too ordinary. You said nobody would have me. Do you remember? The crowd was utterly silent now, hanging on every word. Several people looked uncomfortable, clearly remembering that night at the spring social, the casual cruelty they'd witnessed or participated in through their silence. I was angry, Thomas said, his voice desperate now. I didn't mean... You meant every word, Clara said quietly. And I'm grateful, because your rejection freed me to find someone who sees my actual worth, someone who chose me when he thought I had nothing. Someone who values partnership over profit. She turned to address the crowd again, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I've learned something these past weeks. Worth isn't determined by who chooses you or who rejects you. It's not measured in dollars or status or public opinion. It's inherent. Every person has it, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. Her eyes found Mrs. Dixon, who was openly crying now. Some people see that worth clearly. Others need to be taught to look for it. I'm going to use my resources to create opportunities for people to discover their own worth through education, healthcare, fair employment. Mayor Pemberton finally found his voice, his political instincts overriding his shock. Mrs. Hart, the town would be honored to discuss your generous plans. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting with the town council. I'll send my attorney to arrange the details, Clara said crisply. But understand this, my investments come with conditions. Fair wages for workers, safe conditions. No discrimination based on gender or background. Any business that wants access to estate capital will agree to these terms. She saw several of the business owners exchange uncomfortable glances. These were men accustomed to running things their own way, paying workers as little as possible, maximizing profit without concern for human cost. Clara's terms would change everything. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to visit with Mrs. Dixon. Joseph, would you and Mr. Sawyer handle the bank documents? She turned to Thomas's father, who stood frozen near the church steps. Mr. Bennett, your bank currently holds several loans from my estate. I believe we need to discuss the terms of those arrangements. My attorney will call on you this afternoon. The elder Bennett nodded numbly, clearly still processing the revelation that the girl he'd considered beneath his son was now his bank's primary creditor. Clara took Mrs. Dixon's arm and began walking toward the boarding house, leaving the shocked crowd behind. Sarah Pemberton's voice rose sharply, demanding answers from Thomas. The mayor called after Clara, trying to arrange meetings and curry favor, but Clara kept walking, her head high, her step confident. Behind her she heard Joseph's voice, low and calm, discussing business with the Bennetts. She smiled slightly, knowing he was handling it with the same quiet competence he brought to everything. He didn't need to defend her or prove anything. He simply stood in her corner, solid and real, and exactly what she needed. At the boarding house, Mrs. Dixon made tea with trembling hands. I can't believe it. All this time you were Clara. Your mother never said a word. All those years struggling, working, living in that tiny cabin. She was protecting me, Clara said softly, from fortune hunters, from her husband's family, from people who'd value me for money rather than character. She gave me a gift, the chance to know who I was without wealth defining me. And Joseph? Did he know all along? Clara explained everything, the lawyers, the search, Joseph's assignment to find and protect her. Mrs. Dixon listened with widening eyes, occasionally shaking her head in amazement. So he married you as part of the job, Mrs. Dixon said slowly. But Clara, the way that man looks at you, that's not duty, that's love. I know, Clara said, warmth flooding through her. It started as an assignment, but it became real, became a choice we both made freely. She touched the ring on her finger, the symbol of their second beginning. We're getting married again, properly, a real ceremony with people we love present. And Mrs. Dixon, I'd like you to stand with me. You've been more family than almost anyone." The older woman's tears flowed freely now. "Oh, my dear girl, of course I will." They sat together, drinking tea, talking about everything and nothing, plans for the school, gossip about town reactions, memories of Clara's mother. Through the window, Clara could see Joseph and Martin Sawyer conducting business with various town leaders who'd suddenly discovered urgent need to speak with the Whitmore estate representatives. And somewhere out there, Thomas Bennet was learning that some mistakes couldn't be undone with apologies or opportunities. Some doors, once closed, stayed closed. Clara felt no bitterness about it, just a quiet sense of justice and the peaceful knowledge that she'd found her way to exactly where she belonged. 6 months passed, like water flowing downhill, inevitable, natural, right. Clara and Joseph settled into life as partners in every sense, managing the estate together, making decisions as a team, building something that honored both the past and the future they were creating. The mountain house became their true home, expanded and improved, but never losing its essential character. Clara kept the carved furniture her mother had ensured would be waiting, added books and music and comfort. Joseph built her a proper study where she could manage estate business, with windows overlooking the valley and a desk large enough to spread out contracts and maps and plans. They worked side by side most days, consulting on decisions, challenging each other's assumptions, finding solutions neither would have discovered alone. The new school in Willow Creek opened in September, a 2-story building with real blackboards and desks, and a library that made Clara weep when she first saw it stocked with books. They'd hired 2 teachers, a young woman from Denver with modern ideas about education, and a retired professor from back east who'd come west for his health and found purpose teaching frontier children. 30 students enrolled that first year, from families who'd never imagined their children would have access to real education. The medical clinic opened a month later, staffed by a young doctor and his wife, who served as nurse. They treated injuries and illnesses, delivered babies, and provided care regardless of ability to pay. Clara had established a fund to cover costs for those who couldn't afford it, her grandfather's money doing the opposite of what he'd intended, helping rather than exploiting. The sawmills operated under new management with new rules, fair wages, 8-hour days, safety equipment, days off. The other business owners had complained bitterly, said Clara would ruin the territory's economy with her soft-hearted policies. But productivity actually increased when workers weren't exhausted and injured. Loyalty replaced resentment. The changes spread slowly to other businesses, not out of goodness, but out of competition for reliable workers. Thomas Bennet's family bank had been forced to accept Clara's terms for continued capital access. Fair lending practices, reasonable interest rates, no foreclosures without exhausting every other option. Thomas himself had left town 3 months ago, his engagement to Sarah dissolved in mutual recrimination, his reputation damaged beyond repair. Clara heard he'd gone to San Francisco, seeking opportunities far from the scene of his humiliation. She felt sorry for him in a distant way, the kind of pity you feel for someone who destroyed their own chances through pride and poor judgment. The search for Clara's father had yielded results, though not the kind she'd hoped for. Trackers found remains in a remote canyon 30 miles north, a body that had lain there for years, identified by the items found nearby. Nathaniel Whitmore had fallen, it seemed, during his final search for the mountain property. He'd died within 5 miles of the house he'd been seeking, never knowing how close he'd come to success. Clara and Joseph buried him properly in a clearing near the house, with a marker that read, "Nathaniel Whitmore, beloved father, man of principle." Reverend Cole came from Willow Creek to say words over the grave. Mrs. Dixon brought flowers, and Clara finally got to say goodbye to the man who'd loved her enough to give up everything, including his life, trying to secure her future. "He found it in the end," Joseph said that evening, as they sat on their porch, watching sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Maybe not the way he planned, but you're here. You claimed what he wanted you to have. He succeeded. Clara leaned against her husband's shoulder, thinking about legacies and choices and the strange ways life circles back on itself. I wish he could have seen it, could have known he did enough. Maybe he does know, Joseph said. I'm not much for religion, but I like to think the people we love can see when we honor what they tried to give us. They'd married again in August, a proper ceremony in Willow Creek, with half the territory in attendance. Clara wore a dress of ivory silk, nothing like the plain grey of their first wedding. Joseph wore a new suit, but looked uncomfortable in it until Clara laughed and told him to take off the tie, that she'd married a mountain man and didn't want him pretending to be anything else. Mrs. Dixon stood with Clara, crying through the entire ceremony. Martin Sawyer stood with Joseph, having become a genuine friend rather than just an attorney. Reverend Cole beamed through the vows, clearly satisfied with how the story had turned out. The reception lasted until midnight, with music and dancing and celebration. Clara danced with Joseph, with Mrs. Dixon, with the mayor, who'd finally stopped trying to manipulate her for political advantage. She watched the townspeople who'd pitied her months ago, now treating her with respect that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with what she'd accomplished with it. Now, in the peaceful quiet of evening, Clara wore 2 brooches, her mother's cameo, and a new one Joseph had commissioned. The new piece showed 2 profiles, carved in matching ivory, facing toward each other in eternal conversation. It was a gift for their second wedding, a symbol of partnership and choice and love built on honest foundation. I've been thinking, Clara said, watching the last light fade from the sky, about expanding the school, adding higher grades, maybe eventually a small college. This territory needs educated people, doctors, lawyers, teachers, engineers. Why should families have to send their children east for education? Joseph smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes in ways that made Clara's heart warm. That'll take years to build, decades maybe. Good thing we have time. Then, good thing we have each other. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching stars emerge one by one overhead. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called a lonely sound that somehow felt companionable. The creek murmured its endless song. The mountains stood sentinel, unchanged and unchanging, witnessing this small human moment of peace. Clara thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, heartbroken, humiliated, convinced she had no value because one man had said so publicly. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, to this porch, this life, this man beside her who'd seen her worth when even she couldn't. She thought about her mother's wisdom in planning for this moment, her father's sacrifice in searching for something better, and all the choices that had led her to this precise point in time and space. "You know what the best part is?" she said quietly. "What's that?" Thomas was right about one thing. Nobody would have me, nobody like him, nobody who measured worth in appearances and bank accounts and social standing. But somebody did have me. Somebody who valued the things that actually matter. She turned to look at Joseph, this rough mountain man with kind eyes and steady hands and a heart big enough to hold her entirely. "You had me, and I have you. That's worth more than all the timber and gold and land in the territory." Joseph pulled her close, kissing her forehead gently. "We have each other," he agreed. "Everything else is just details." They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, until the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, until the mountains settled into sleep under the moon's watch. And when they finally went to bed, it was in the house her grandfather built, on land her father found, in the life they'd chosen together, built on truth and trust, and the simple, radical notion that worth is inherent, not assigned, and love is a choice you make every single day. The story of Clara Whitmore Hart and the fortune nobody knew she had became legend in the territory. But the real story, the one that mattered, was quieter. It was about a woman who learned her own value in the space between rejection and redemption, about a man who kept faith with his promises even when nobody was watching, about love that started as obligation and transformed into choice, about legacy and what we do with the gifts and burdens the past hands us. And it was about finding home not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the steady presence of someone who sees you clearly and chooses you anyway, every morning, for all the mornings that follow.